Welcome back to Untold Revenge Files. Today, the story you're about to hear takes place in Westbrook, Virginia. My name is Marcus Chin. I'm 27 years old, and I'm about to tell you about the night my mother laughed while a stranger dismantled my dignity, and how that single moment changed everything I thought I knew about family. Growing up in my mother's house meant understanding one unspoken rule above all others: appearances mattered more than people. My mother, Denise, had spent her entire adult life curating an image of success, sophistication, and control. Our house was always spotless when guests came over. Our conversations were always polished. Our problems were always hidden behind closed doors. I learned early that my role was to be quiet, polite, and invisible whenever she needed me to be. When she was between relationships, I was her confidant, her emotional support, her reason for getting through the hard days. But the moment a new man entered the picture, I became furniture. Background noise, something to be managed. For years, I accepted this. I told myself she'd had a hard life. My father left when I was 4, and she'd raised me alone while working 2 jobs. I owed her patience. I owed her understanding. At least that's what I believed. What I didn't understand then was that gratitude and self-respect aren't supposed to be enemies. 6 months before the dinner that changed everything, I had made a decision that my mother never fully supported. I left my corporate IT job to work as a freelance software developer. The cubicle life was draining me. 60-hour weeks, constant stress, no creative freedom. Freelancing meant I could work from home, choose my own projects, and actually enjoy what I did for a living. The transition wasn't easy. There were slow months. There were moments of doubt. But by the time my mother started dating Victor Harmon, I had built a steady client base. I was earning more than I had at my old job. I was proud of what I'd accomplished. My mother never asked about my work, not once. To her, working from home in sweatpants meant I wasn't really working. To her, success looked like a suit in a corner office, not a laptop on a kitchen table. So when she invited me to a family dinner to meet Victor, the new man she kept describing as accomplished and established, I already felt the familiar pressure settling into my chest. Be polite, be quiet. Don't embarrass her. The evening started the way these things always started. Small talk, forced smiles. My aunt and uncle were there, my cousin Rachel, and of course, Victor. He was in his early 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of confident posture that made you assume he was important before he even opened his mouth. And he knew it. Within 15 minutes, he had steered the conversation toward himself, his real estate ventures, his investment portfolio, his connections in city government. Every sentence was designed to impress, and everyone at the table was playing along beautifully. I stayed quiet, eating my food, nodding when appropriate. I had learned that invisibility was the safest place to be in moments like this. Then Victor turned to me. "So, Marcus," he said, leaning back in his chair with that particular smile people wear when they already know the answer to the question they're about to ask. "Still unemployed?" "Before I tell you exactly what happened next, tell me, what time is it where you are right now, and where are you watching from?" I'm really curious to see how far this story will travel. The table erupted in laughter. My aunt chuckled nervously. My uncle grinned. My cousin looked down at her plate. And my mother, my own mother, laughed first. Not nervously, not apologetically, proudly, as if Victor had just said something clever, as if his words confirmed something she'd been thinking all along. I sat frozen, my fork halfway to my mouth, feeling something cold spread through my chest. The laughter wasn't even malicious. It was casual, easy, like I wasn't even worth taking seriously. "He's actually," I started to explain. "Marcus does some computer thing from home," my mother interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "You know how these young people are, always on their laptops." Victor nodded with exaggerated understanding. "Ah, the gig economy. Well, hopefully something stable comes along soon. A man needs a real career, something he can be proud of." More nods around the table, more agreement, more silence from the one person who should have known better. That was the betrayal, not Victor's comment. He didn't know me. He was just a man performing confidence for an audience. But my mother? She knew I was working. She knew I had clients. She knew I was building something real. And she chose to let an outsider reduce me to a punchline just to protect the image of her perfect new relationship. I stayed silent, the way I'd been trained to. I finished my dinner. I smiled when expected. I shook Victor's hand when I left and told him it was nice to meet him. But something had shifted. As I drove home that night, my hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, I replayed the evening in my mind. Not just the humiliation, that I could have forgiven. What I kept returning to was something Victor had said. In all his bragging, he'd mentioned details about his work that didn't quite add up. A development deal that didn't match public records I vaguely remembered reading about. A business title that sounded impressive but meant nothing when I actually thought about it. My embarrassment slowly turned into curiosity. I had no idea that one night of quiet research would finally break me and change everything. The next morning, I woke up at 4 a.m., staring at the ceiling, my stomach still tight with the residue of humiliation. I kept hearing that laughter, not just Victor's, everyone's. The casual cruelty of it, the way my mother's eyes had sparkled with something that looked almost like satisfaction. I wanted to believe I was overreacting. I wanted to call her and hear her apologize, explain that she hadn't meant it the way it seemed. But I knew her well enough to know that call would never go the way I needed it to. So instead, I opened my laptop. I started with Victor's name, just a simple search. Within an hour, I had pulled up property records, business registrations, and LinkedIn profiles. What I found didn't match the man who had sat at my mother's table speaking with such authority about his empire. The real estate development company he'd bragged about? It existed, barely. A small LLC with no significant completed projects. The investment portfolio he'd mentioned? No evidence of it anywhere. The connections in city government? A few photographs at public events that anyone could attend. Victor Harmon wasn't a fraud in the criminal sense. He wasn't running a scam. He was something almost more pathetic. A man who had built an entire identity around exaggeration. Inflated titles. Empty claims. A carefully rehearsed performance designed to impress people who didn't know any better. People like my mother. I saved everything. Screenshots, links, notes. Not because I had a plan yet, but because I had learned from experience that evidence matters more than emotions. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was my mother. "Marcus, Victor really enjoyed meeting you last night," she said, her voice light and cheerful. "He thinks you have potential. He might even have some opportunities for you if you're interested in getting into something more serious." I felt my jaw tighten. Opportunities? You know, real work. He knows people. He could help you. There it was again. The assumption that what I was doing didn't count. The implication that I needed rescuing by a man whose greatest skill was apparently lying about his accomplishments. "I'm actually doing fine with my work, Mom," I said carefully. "I have clients. I'm making good money." She sighed. That particular sigh she used when she thought I was being difficult. "Marcus, I'm just trying to help. You don't have to be so defensive. Victor is very successful and he's willing to take you under his wing. Most people would be grateful." I wanted to tell her. I wanted to say, "He's not what he says he is." I looked him up. "He's performing for you." But something stopped me. Maybe it was the knowledge that she wouldn't believe me. Maybe it was the realization that even if she did, she'd find a way to make it my fault for ruining things. Or maybe it was the quiet understanding that this conversation wasn't about Victor at all. It was about the fact that my own mother had chosen a stranger's approval over her son's dignity. "I'll think about it," I said, and ended the call. That evening, I met my friend Daniel for drinks. Daniel was the kind of person who never judged but always told the truth. A rare combination. When I told him about the dinner, about Victor's comment, about my mother's laughter, he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he took a long drink of his beer and looked at me. "You already know your answer, Marcus." "What do you mean? Would you accept that treatment from a stranger, from a coworker, from anyone else in your life?" I shook my head slowly. "Then why accept it from her?" He leaned forward. I've watched you make excuses for your mom for years. She had it hard. She did her best. She doesn't mean it that way. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, at what point does understanding become enabling? At what point does loyalty become self-destruction? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But that night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront my mother. I wasn't going to expose Victor at some dramatic family gathering. I was simply going to stop pretending, stop performing, stop shrinking myself to fit into a role that had never fit me. I blocked my mother's number, not forever. I wasn't ready for that. Just for a week. Just to breathe. Just to hear my own thoughts without her voice drowning them out. Then I did something I'd been putting off for months. I applied for a technical certification program that would expand my skills and my client base. I signed up for a networking event in the city. I started treating my career like the legitimate business it was, instead of the computer thing my mother dismissed. The next morning, I woke up with exhaustion in my bones and uncertainty in my chest, but underneath both, something else. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't waiting for my mother's approval. I wasn't shaping my decisions around her opinions. I was done shrinking. It was time to grow. 6 months passed. In that time, I completed my certification, landed 3 major contracts, and doubled my annual income. I hired a part-time assistant to handle administrative tasks. I rented a small office space so I could separate my work life from my personal life. For the first time, I felt like I was building something sustainable, something mine. I also rebuilt my social circle. Daniel introduced me to his wife's group of friends, creative, driven people who asked real questions and listened to real answers. I started attending industry meetups, connecting with other developers, even mentoring a few beginners. I wasn't looking for a new family, but slowly, I was finding one anyway. My mother and I hadn't spoken in months. At first, she had left angry voicemails, then concerned ones, then silence. I heard through my cousin Rachel that she was devastated by my abandonment, a word choice that told me everything I needed to know about how the story was being told. If you've ever distanced yourself from family, you know what I mean. The person who set the boundary becomes the villain. The person who crossed every boundary becomes the victim. I had made peace with that. Then, one afternoon, Rachel called me. "I have to tell you something," she said, her voice careful. "About Victor." I listened as she explained what had happened. Someone in Victor's social circle, someone with actual connections, had started asking questions about his supposed business ventures. The more they dug, the more the facade crumbled. Fake references, exaggerated credentials, partnerships that never existed. Victor hadn't broken any laws, but in the world he was trying to operate in, a world built on reputation and trust, perception was everything. And once people started talking, the perception shifted fast. "Your mom is humiliated," Rachel said quietly. "She keeps saying she was fooled, that she had no idea." "And how is she treating you these days?" I asked. Rachel hesitated. "The same as always." "Why?" "Because my mom knew exactly what kind of man Victor was. She just didn't want to see it. She wanted the image more than the truth." There was a long pause. "You're right," Rachel finally admitted. "I think I've known that for a while. I just didn't want to say it out loud." Before I continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone you trusted choose an illusion over you? Have you ever been the sacrifice someone made to protect a fantasy? Let me know in the comments, because I think more of us have been there than we realize. Weeks later, I learned more details. Victor had quietly moved on from my mother's life. Whether by his choice or hers, no one was entirely clear. My mother was left explaining his absence to the same family members she had proudly introduced him to, the same aunt and uncle who had laughed at that dinner, the same people who had nodded along to his empty boasts. Knowing this should have felt like victory. The man who mocked me was exposed. The mother who laughed was embarrassed. Justice, in a poetic sense. But that's not how it felt. Mostly, I felt tired of the performance, tired of the cycles, tired of watching my mother choose image over honesty over and over again and expecting different results. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I didn't reach out to say, I told you so. I just kept building my life. Because the real lesson wasn't about Victor. It was about recognizing that I had spent years waiting for my mother to see me clearly and finally accepting that she might never choose to. A year after the dinner that started everything, my life looked unrecognizable. I had moved to a new apartment, brighter, larger, with a home office that didn't double as my bedroom. My business had grown to the point where I was turning down projects, not chasing them. I had spoken at 2 industry conferences. I had even started a blog helping other developers transition to freelance work, something that brought me more fulfillment than I'd expected. Most importantly, I had stopped measuring my worth by anyone's approval except my own. That's when my mother reached out. Not through a call. She had learned I wouldn't answer those. She sent a letter, handwritten. The first one she'd sent me in probably 15 years. It started with small talk, updates about the house, comments about the weather. Then, slowly, it moved toward the point. She was lonely. She had made mistakes. She didn't understand why I had abandoned her during such a difficult time. She wanted to talk. She wanted to meet. She wanted to move forward like a family again. Reading that letter, I felt something I hadn't expected. Grief. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just a deep, quiet sadness for the relationship we never had, and probably never would. I took 3 days to respond. Not because I was crafting the perfect revenge, not because I wanted her to suffer in uncertainty, but because I needed to be sure I was responding from clarity, not emotion. When I finally wrote back, I kept it simple. Mom, I hope you're doing well. I'm not willing to pretend the last year didn't happen, and I'm not able to go back to the way things were. The distance between us isn't punishment. It's protection. For both of us. I wish you peace and happiness. I really do. But I've learned that wishing someone well doesn't mean I have to give them access to my life. Take care of yourself. Marcus. She responded within days. The tone was different, sharper. She accused me of being cold, unforgiving. She said she had apologized. She hadn't, and that I was holding a grudge over one bad dinner. I didn't respond. A few weeks later, I heard from Rachel that my mother had started telling people I was troubled and distant because of my career stress. The narrative, as always, had shifted to protect her image. I was no longer the son who set boundaries. I was the son who couldn't handle success. It should have hurt. Maybe a year ago it would have. But I had learned something in that year of silence and growth. My mother's version of events wasn't about me. It never had been. It was about maintaining a story that made her the hero and me the problem. And I didn't have to participate in that story anymore. I had my own life now, my own definition of success, my own people who knew the truth. So after everything you've heard, if you were standing where I am now, with a mother asking you to pretend the humiliation never happened, would you go back and call it forgiveness, or would you choose freedom and call it self-respect? There's no wrong answer. Every situation is different. Every family has its own history. But I'll tell you what I learned through all of this. Love doesn't mean access. Forgiveness doesn't require reunion. And setting boundaries isn't cruelty. It's clarity. My mother still has my aunt. She has my uncle. She has Rachel. When Rachel chooses to be available, she has options. I didn't take everything from her. I just stopped letting her take everything from me. Some nights, I still think about that dinner. The laughter, her face, the way I felt like I was shrinking into my chair, but the memory doesn't carry the same weight anymore. It's not a wound. It's a reminder of who I was and who I chose to become. And maybe that's the only real revenge that matters. Not destroying the people who hurt you, but building a life they can't diminish. Not proving them wrong, but proving yourself right. Not waiting for an apology that may never come, but learning to live fully without it. I don't know what the future holds for my mother and me. Maybe one day something will change. Maybe she'll do the real work of seeing her own patterns. Maybe we'll find a new kind of relationship, one built on honesty instead of performance. Or maybe we won't. Either way, I'll be okay. Because the real lesson was never about employment or status or who laughed at that table. It was about recognizing that a mother who sacrifices her child's dignity for approval has already chosen sides, and walking away is sometimes the only form of self-respect left. If you're watching this and you see yourself in any part of this story, I want you to know you're not alone, and you're not wrong for wanting to be treated with basic respect by the people who are supposed to love you most. That's not too much to ask. It never was. If this story touched you in any way, if you saw yourself in Marcus, or if it reminded you of someone you love, or even someone you had to let go, I want you to take a moment and leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Tell me what you felt. Tell me if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect. Because the truth is, these stories aren't just stories, they're mirrors. And sometimes hearing someone else's journey is the first step to understanding your own. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And if this one meant something to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. You never know whose life you might change with a single click. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being part of this community. Until next time, take care of yourself, protect your peace, and remember, you are always worth more than the way someone chooses to treat you. I'll see you in the next one.